So Jeff, the cover of the next issue of The Atlantic is your story on the execution of Clayton Lockett. So why don't you begin at the beginning and tell us who was Clayton Lockett and how was he killed?
So Clayton Lockett was a convicted murderer. He had presided over a night of just terror in which one young woman, 19 years old, was shot and buried alive. Another woman was raped, and a third person, a young man, was beaten. He was convicted, given the death penalty, and after his appeals process had expired, he was executed in this botched execution that happened about a year ago.
And the heart of your story is this really sort of cinematic narrative of his execution by the state of Oklahoma. How did you manage to piece the story together in such detail?
Yeah, well, this was really difficult because there were very few people involved in the execution who were willing to cooperate. In fact, nobody directly involved was. And what we ended up doing is getting a hold of some redacted documents. The Department of Public Safety put out a very brief executive summary, but as part of that investigation, they performed hundreds of hours of interviews, and there were transcripts. During one of the legal cases, those transcripts were made part of discovery, and for about 12 hours they were in the public record before a judge put them under seal. And we got a hold of them because one of our sources downloaded them while they were still part of the public record.
What went wrong?
Well, a lot of things went wrong. I think primarily there was a huge amount of pressure. There was a drug that nobody had much experience with. There was a push to get 2 executions done in one night, which has very little, it's almost unprecedented. And I think also the notion that this is something that can be done clinical is really being exposed is probably not the case.
You describe a really extraordinary struggle over several hours in an effort to plant the IV in the first place. How many times do they have to?
16 times.
16 times before they can find a vein. But you also raise really pressing questions about the nature of the drugs themselves. Our prisons had effectively become drug smugglers.
Yeah, so one of the things is that in the desperation to get a hold of drugs in order to carry out executions that had been scheduled, as drugs became increasingly harder to get for a number of reasons, prisons began looking overseas, initially to England and elsewhere in Europe, and then even to India, trying to convince people to supply them with drugs, in some cases successfully. In some cases they actually had to lie to pharmaceutical companies in order to convince them to release the drugs. Nebraska hired a middleman who went to a company that manufactured drugs in India and convinced them he was trying to get the drugs for approval to be used in Zambia. And of course there's a really tragic need for cheap surgical drugs in Africa. So this is the kind of thing that began to happen as executions were scheduled and states had run out of drugs.
And Oklahoma had completely shielded all of this from any public scrutiny, is that
Yeah,
right?
This is another thing. I mean, it was always been something they've tried to keep secret, but in 2011 they actually passed a law that made these things essentially state secrets. You could not find out what drugs were being used, where they were getting them from, who was supplying them, certainly who was in the execution chamber.
And so how did Oklahoma wind up settling on the drug that actually is now before the Supreme Court to be used as a sedative in this execution?
So they went through a number of different choices. They ended up on the drug midazolam because they believed it was similar to a drug they'd been using called pentobarbital, except it was much more widely available because there were a number of different companies that were manufacturing it.
Among the people who carried out the execution of Clayton Lockett, did you feel that there were good guys and bad guys?
So initially I had sort of assumed that in order for someone to go into a situation like this and execute someone, that's someone that I would not be able to relate to. And as I began to learn a little bit more from these people's transcripts from this investigation, and from talking to a few members of the Department of Corrections who had since retired, my mindset shifted a little bit. Many of them are people who are put in this position of carrying out somebody else's orders, a jury, a judge, the government, and are doing it to the best of their ability, are trying to do it as humanely as possible. And I began to view many of them, the warden, many of the other people involved, as actually rather sympathetic characters who were put in a very difficult position.
And do you have any sense how any of those central actors feel about their participation in it in retrospect?
I'm a little bit resistant of trying to get too much in their heads, except some of them were fairly expressive about how they felt and how they were reacting. in the transcripts that we have. And I think many of them were very disturbed. The warden, for example, spends a fair amount of time with the offender in the days leading up to his execution. Has to go and sit there by herself with this person who's a convicted murderer. And there are several moments, very surreal moments in the death chamber, where she's talking to him, trying to calm him down, trying to joke with him.
About his drug of choice, for example.
His drug of
right?
choice.
It's a surreal moment.
Trying to make him comfortable, wiping his mouth off, because he says, "Can you wipe my mouth off?" And there are these in a different situation, it would almost be touching. And the fact that she's in this situation and she's clearly doing the best she can, it's troubling, it's surreal, and for me it was disturbing, and it became easier for me to actually sympathize with her.
So this question is now before the Supreme Court, whether this punishment in particular, this kind of punishment using these sorts of drugs, amounts to cruel and unusual treatment. And do you have any guess? We've had oral arguments now. Do you have any guess what the court's likely to do here?
I think that it's unlikely that there's going to be a very broad ruling. I think that if anything, it may be ruled that midazolam in particular it cannot reliably prevent cruel and unusual punishment. But this won't be the last that we hear of this, I think, because it's such a narrow issue, it's such a narrow question before the court. I don't think this will be the end.